and Famine, and your latest book, The Twilight of Democracy. And you also worked for a number of newspapers and magazines like Economist, Spectator, Washington Post, and now Atlantic Magazine. And my name is Per Svensson, and I'm a journalist with Dagens Nyheter. So I would like to start asking you about a more personal question. You're raised in an agnostic Jewish family in the United States. And I wondered to which extent this Jewish heritage has been a factor in your life, or is a factor in your life.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to be with this audience, even if it's only virtual and not in real life. That's a strange question for me to answer because I can't do the ahistorical version. I mean, what would my life have been like if I was not Jewish? So it's hard for me to know exactly what that means. I did not grow up in a religious family particularly, and I am not at all religious now. I don't think of myself particularly as being Jewish as opposed to being American or being Polish. I now have a Polish passport, or being myriad number of other things. It's not the most important part of my identity, but I certainly have a Jewish surname, and so probably that's affected the way people perceive me in some parts of Europe and the United States. And maybe the knowledge of that heritage drew me to some of the themes and topics that I'm interested in. But it's, as I say, that's I would have to do a kind of counterfactual analysis in order to be able to answer fully. I certainly am happy to be part of Jewish events and Jewish festivals. I was part of one, actually. I mean, this is the miracle of the pandemic era literary festival. I was part of a Jewish the Jewish literary festival in Krakow last night, also in this room, by Zoom, and now I'm part of your event in Stockholm. So yeah, I'm happy to be part of all those things. But as I said, it's not I don't think of it as a kind of determining factor in my life right now.
But I ask about you moved to Poland in the 80s as a correspondent for Economist. And I wanted to, was anti-Semitism something you was confronted with at that time, as in the 80s when you were a younger journalist in Poland?
No. I mean, certainly I first visited Poland in 1985 or 86, but I moved here to work as 87, but later than that. But anyway, I moved here to work as a journalist in 1988, and I didn't have any real experiences with anti-Semitism at all, actually. I mean, nothing directed at me personally, until very recently. Was one amusing incident this was in the run up to the first Polish elections in 1989, where I went with another colleague to interview, who was also Jewish, to interview two Polish politicians who said something about Jews or people of Jewish, and we started to laugh because they didn't realize, I'm called Anne Applebaum, and my friend also had a Jewish surname, and they didn't actually recognize us as Jewish, even though they were talking about Jews. So it was a kind of theoretical thing. It didn't affect me personally at all. And it didn't seem to be a major important part of the culture, at least not in politics and not in Warsaw.
But has it changed now? I mean, during the recent presidential elections, for example, have you been confronted with it or seen it in public life in Poland?
So yes, the current ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, has brought some anti-Semitic themes and emotions back into mainstream politics that were not here at all. And I would say weren't here at all for the last 30 years. I mean, again, you can always find anti-Semitism here like you can everywhere. But they deliberately reinvented it. This time it now takes the form in two forms. One is paranoia that American Jews might come back and reclaim property in Poland, and there's some paranoia about that. And then there's a second version of it, which is that the world does not recognize the degree to which Poland suffered during the Second World War, and somehow the Jews are to blame for that, or the Israelis sometimes are to blame for the fact that we aren't recognized for our suffering. And there's an underlying kernel of truth to that, in that it's true that people don't know the history of the Second World War, and they don't know what happened in Poland, in most of Europe, and certainly not in the United States. But there's an anti-Semitic edge, almost a sense of competition, for victimhood. I mean, this is a ruling party that indulges the sense of victimization. We have been put upon by the world. We're owed something. The sense of grievance, which is such an important part of modern populism, is part of the ruling ethos here. I mean, it's the sort of anti-Semitism isn't their most important theme. More recently, they've focused much harder on sort of homophobia and anti-gay propaganda and language, because that seems to have more resonance with their voters. I mean, Jews are still a pretty distant theme here, and they're not, they're not an important part of public life or even anybody's everyday life. But yeah, absolutely the ruling party has brought it back. You can see it on versions of this on state television, and some of it does get directed at me. Not that I am especially bothered by it, but I have noticed it.
So on a more general level, would you say that contemporary way of authoritarian populism, which is the theme of your book, is often fueled by hostility towards immigrants? That's a well-known fact, but is it also fueled by anti-Semitism, would you say?
I mean, they tried to use immigrants here. They tried to use them as a theme, and it didn't really catch on, partly because there aren't any. You just don't see any on the street. And so it's a hard theme to make people very upset about. I mean, you can threaten them, the immigrants are coming from somewhere else, but they aren't here. So it didn't work for the ruling party, for the Law and Justice Party. It didn't work for them. As I said, anti-Semitism doesn't really work for them either, because it's, again, not a live issue. But again, homophobia does seem to work. Maybe it's connected to people's fears of losing their children to Western values or to some alternative civilization. Maybe there's some deeper reason why it functions in a way that these older prejudices don't. I mean, but yes, you're right. I mean, this modern form of authoritarian populism requires some kind of enemy. We the people, the real nation, are being somehow victimized or pushed aside or threatened by either a minority or by a corrupt elite or by traitors or by foreigners. And so that's that way of thinking and speaking is what is being used to appeal to people, and they need some enemies. And sometimes Jews work as the enemy, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. As one example, I mean, Poland and Hungary are considered two primary examples of Twilight of Democracy in the book, one could say. And in Hungary, you have this fixation with Viktor Orban's fixation and campaigns against George Soros. How should one explain that? I mean,
that's a much more openly, clearly anti-Semitic game. I mean, it's focusing so much on Soros and his supposed plot to destroy Hungary, and his plot to import immigrants to destroy Hungarianness. I mean, this is all, this is very classic. It's a very, very old ideas about the Jews seeking to undermine us. It's much more overt. I mean, of course, Orban himself would never say anything negative about Jews using that language. He's more sophisticated than his Polish counterparts. And he makes a great song and dance of being friends with the Israeli government and so on. So he guards against it, but the Soros game in Hungary is the most. I mean, I think it's really the only European country, in modern times, to use so openly anti-Semitism as a central part of government communications and government propaganda. It's very stark and obvious.
Yeah. And considering that, how do you see the future for Hungary and Poland in the European Union on the long run, so to speak? I mean, there are this conflict between the Union and these countries at the moment that has been, considering this mechanism for rule of law and so on.
So there are two ways to answer that. I mean, I don't think that Hungary and Poland are as exceptional as it seems. In other words, I think that we have these kind of political parties exist in most European countries. I can well imagine if Marine Le Pen wins the French presidential election, in a couple of years' time. I can imagine, a very similar kind of politics dominating France. I mean, so it's not unthinkable. I mean, we have parties like this in Spain. We have one in Germany. We have them in Scandinavian countries. It's not unknown everywhere. It's just that in Poland and Hungary, Poles and Hungarians, I would say it this way, have had the bad luck to have these parties win elections and gain power. And once they've gained power, they've then sought to undermine their democracies in very clear ways. There's some other examples of, not going quite so far, but other populist leaders elsewhere in the continent who would like to do that or don't yet have the votes or the support to do it. So I think there's a spectrum in Poland and Hungary at one end of it, but I don't think they're exceptional. The reason why they've been in direct conflict with the EU is because of, the EU very, very belatedly, I mean, many years too late, has realized that the rule of law and the guarantee of an independent court system is absolutely necessary to the functioning of the European Union and the single market. I mean, you can't have a system in which laws and regulations are enforced the same way in 27 different countries if in one of those countries the law is politicized and the courts are politicized. And so it was, and so there have been these clauses of, calling, saying that, implying that there will be more enforcement of the rule of law or an attempt. Poland has packed its courts and has now it's a very strange moment because there's almost two court systems. There's the sort of legitimate courts and then these kind of doubler courts. And the EU has put some measures into the budget saying that they can use monetary tools to put pressure on Poland, and Poland and Hungary together objected to that law or that regulation. They've both since been convinced to drop their objections and to allow the budget to go forward as well as to the COVID fund to go forward. And it's still not really clear to me why. I mean, it may just be that they realized that by themselves they were, they were going to, create too many problems for themselves by carrying out the veto. It may also be that they've got some assurances from the European Union that these clauses won't be enforced anyway. It's not exactly clear to me yet what's happened. So their conflict is, to be clear, it's nothing to do with what we were talking about before. It's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's to do with their transformation of their own court systems and the fact that this now clashes with EU laws and rules and norms about apolitical courts. And it hasn't quite been resolved yet. The Polish ruling party would like to continue this process of politicizing its courts, and Viktor Orban would also like to continue politicizing its courts. And it's not clear to me yet how the EU can block them, although theoretically they should be able to.
And it isn't clear to you who actually, I mean, both sides are claiming victory. What would you say? Which side did give in, so to speak?
Actually, technically, Hungary and Poland gave in because the language about rule of law is still in the budget, and it's still in the in EU legislation, and so in theory, the EU can enforce it anytime it wants to. The Commission can. So in that sense, Poland and Hungary gave in. But whether the EU will do that, and whether it whether it has the energy and the creativity to do that, I don't know.
In an earlier book of yours, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, you described and analyzed the Soviet communist takeover in Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, and you pointed out that this takeover everywhere followed the same pattern. The three areas of priority for the communists, they were controlling the secret police, security apparatus, taking control of national radio, and undermining civil society, if I get it right. Could one find or detect a similar pattern today among other populist equivalent among these countries that are going in this authoritarian populist direction? Some key areas that they are focusing on.
In some ways, yes. What do you need to control society? Well, you need control of the security services. And you need the security services to be loyal to you as your party, not to you as the elected leader of the country. In other words, you need some way of making sure that they aren't loyal to the Constitution or to the nation or to the state. They're loyal rather to the ruling party. You need, and you can see everywhere, not just in Poland and Hungary, but in many places, attempts to undermine the independence of the media and to have more control over what is said about the government and what is said about politics. And that's certainly the case in populist governments, authoritarian populist governments now. And then, the third branch is trickier than it used to be. I mean, it's not so easy to control civil society anymore in the way that it was in the 1940s. Running, given that civil society includes everything from, private schools to churches to charities, to human rights organizations. It's not so easy now for the state to reach in and control all of those things. But certainly you've seen pressure on some kinds of civic organizations. You've seen that in Hungary. You've seen pressure on universities. You've seen in some cases, it's not so much pressure on the church as attempts to use the church or create links to the church in order to get it to be part of the state program. So you could certainly say that populists are looking at the same tools of control and the same tools of power. It's not quite a direct analogy because they can't use them in quite the same way that they could. Remember that the societies of Eastern Europe in the 1940s were much more primitive and simple than they are now. And, you can't control Polish public life in the 2020s the way that you could in the 1940s. It's just too complex. But certainly pressure in those same places can be seen.
I know that you have some of the very many of these movements like to call themselves conservatives. They really love that word, conservative. But you don't think that they are conservatives not in a classical sense of the word. But they are rather more like some similarities with the communists, exactly, that they are more revolutionaries or Bolsheviks or.
Yeah, this is actually clearest of all in the United States, where the Republican Party, which has been a conservative party for many decades, and has always called itself that, is really, it's now split, but it's many of its elected officials and certainly the outgoing president are not conservatives in any known definition of that term. I mean, they're radicals. They're radicals who seek to upend and overturn many aspects of the state and of the democracy. So it's not just, as the cliche has it, that they're trying to kind of get rid of the establishment in Washington. They're actually trying to change the rules and undo American democracy. I mean, it's literally happening while we're speaking. There are all kinds of games being played to try and undermine the Electoral College, which is meeting today in the United States, which is something that would have been unthinkable under any previous Republican administration, that the Republican Party would try to challenge the actual rules of American democracy. But so in that sense, they are radical. And in that sense, they're comparable, much more similar to Bolsheviks than to, Edmund Burke or just traditional conservatives. And there are elements of that here too, in Eastern Europe as well. In Hungary, you have the case of or Viktor Orban would have described himself as a conservative, and then he's become more radical with time. Something similar happened here too, actually, that the ruling party grew out of a conservative movement that has also become radicalized. And by radical, I mean they seek to overthrow the institutions of democracy. They want to undermine them. They are not interested in conserving. They're interested in rapid and extreme change. And you could, there are elements of this in the more extreme wings of the British Conservative Party, which has a much different character than it had a decade ago. And of course, you can see these elements in the other radical right movements across Europe, whether it's in France or Germany or Spain as well.
And speaking of the British Conservatives, you actually knew Boris Johnson. You have worked with him. Would you describe him as a conservative? He's the leader of the Conservative Party, but is he a conservative?
So Boris Johnson is something very different altogether, and that I don't think Boris Johnson is ideological at all. I mean, by temperament, he preferred the Tory party because it was a better home for him. Tories appreciated his sense of humor and his manners and his way of speaking. But had opportunities been open for him in the Labour Party or a at one point we had a Liberal Party, if that had been a party of power in the UK, I can imagine him going that way too. When he was at Oxford, actually, he was, I think he ran to be head of the Oxford Union as a social democrat and not a Tory. So, I think he would have taken any party that he thought would win. And I think he would have taken up, any position that he thought would make him prime minister. So talking about him as in those kind of ideological terms doesn't really make sense. As I say, kind of instinctively and culturally, and he belongs in the world of Tory conservative England, and he fits in better there. But I don't think that says that much, very deep about his beliefs.
I have to ask you, I know that you have been asked this question a lot of times, and so on, but I have to do it. And that's the opening scene in your book. It takes place at your house. This house you're in now, actually, I guess.
I'm in the house now. Yes.
Yeah, the house. Yeah, in Poland in 1999, and it's a New Year's Eve party, and the guests are personal but also political friends. You describe them and yourself as center-right, liberal conservatives, would you say? And now I'm quoting the book. Nearly 2 decades later, I would now cross the street to avoid some of the people who were at my New Year's Eve party. They, in turn, would not only refuse to enter my house, they would be embarrassed to admit they had ever been there. In fact, about half of the people who were at my party would no longer speak to the other half. So this is the question: what has happened since then?
So this, I think, is a phenomenon that Swedes will recognize, and most people in most other countries will recognize, which is the phenomenon of shifting political alliances. So I began the book with a story about a party, not because it's a book about parties, although there's a party at the end as well, and there's some mentioned others in between, but because parties are a metaphor for political alliances or groups of friends, people that we know, not necessarily closely, but even superficially, but who we often know through, because they share our worldview somehow. And one of the things that happened a couple of years ago, I realized that that party, so many of the people who were there I wouldn't invite them again, and they wouldn't come. And I realized that this was a bigger change. And one of the reasons for writing the book was that I realized there had been this kind of generational moment when a lot of political alliances shifted in the United States and in England and in Poland as well, and that people had reformed alliances and sort of made new friends and had new allies. And this is just one of those big political shifts that takes place periodically. And I actually, when I was thinking about writing the book, I went and I thought about, what are some of the others? And I got very fascinated by and drawn into the story of the Dreyfus affair, which is described in the book, which is an extraordinary precedent. It's another moment when, people who got along with one another and reckoned they had the same views and who were part of the same salons and went to the same dinners, people who were in the army or who were in the French establishment at the end of the 19th century, suddenly discovered they had these violently different views about Alfred Dreyfus, who was, famously a Jewish officer who was wrongly arrested for treason. And suddenly there was, two groups arose, and some people felt that Dreyfus, whether he was guilty or not, should be condemned because whatever the army said had to be believed. And then there was another group that felt that no, the state had to be fair and just and treat all citizens the same way. And this, suddenly, again, as I said, this French establishment, which split in half. And I had the feeling that something like that had also happened in Poland over the last 5 years, that the establishment split and people discovered suddenly that actually, although they were able to all agree about one thing, they were all anti-communists, and they all agreed it was good for communism to be gone and good for 1989 to happen. After that, they discovered they had some big differences. And of course, a similar split took place in Britain over Brexit. And again, this is, famously, many friends suddenly discovered they couldn't speak to their, there were many discoveries that, suddenly people discovered they had very different views about it, even though they were in the same family or they'd gone to school together or, worked next to one another. And that broke up a lot of friendships and created new political alliances. So that's one of the themes of the book, is how these, alliances change, and things that we imagine to be permanent, or political views or positions that we imagine to be permanent, can change as circumstances change and as the situation changes.
But how should one explain that so many former people that call themselves liberals or defining themselves as center-right has been attracted to, I would say, the dark side of the force, to the populist movement? Is it only a question of opportunism, that is, career opportunities that have been opened when these movements are becoming big and powerful?
No, I don't think that. And the book has a lot of counterexamples. I mean, that's certainly one element. So there is an element. There are people who were frustrated by their inability to. In Poland, there was people who came out of the old opposition, or who were activists when they were teenagers, or anti-communist leaders when they were at university. Sometimes became disappointed later on in post-communist Poland when they didn't have the political or literary or, journalistic careers that they thought they should have. And that created a lot of resentment. But for quite a lot of other people it's a little bit deeper than that. I mean, for a variety of reasons, they became disappointed with their societies. So in Poland, it was disappointment with, the more materialistic, more secular Polish society that evolved, after the 1990s. In the United States, there was disappointment with the nature of modern America, with demographic change, with cultural and social change that not everybody agreed with. In the United Kingdom, England rather, there was disappointment with the feeling that, the specialness of England was being somehow lost in this world of Europe, and they didn't like having to negotiate regulations with other European countries. They wanted back that feeling of, greatness or specialness or difference that they'd had in the past. So usually what you have is a sense of something about the modern world has disappointed them, and not a lot. So it's a radical disappointment. I mean, in the book, I use the expression cultural despair. They become despairing, angry. They feel that the current political system doesn't allow for any cures. Nothing is changing in the way they want it to change. And then they become attracted to radical movements that do offer much more radical roads to change.
So you would say they are really true believers, most of them, or some of them. You really believe in they are really true believers. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yes. I mean, they believe in something. It can be very hard to tell. And also remember that the human brain is very complex, and all of us are capable of having, simultaneously personal motives, political motives, career motives, lots of motives together that propel us forward or make us persuade us to do things. And so it can be hard to sort out the cynics from the true believers. There are one or two people, if you remember in the book, there's one in particular who I interview. This is Maria Schmidt, who's a famous Hungarian intellectual who runs a very important museum in Budapest, who I genuinely don't know whether she is cynical or not cynical. I don't know whether she's believes in, that George Soros is the source of all evil and, the West is trying to undermine Hungarianness, or whether she's just saying that. I mean, I think she's too clever to believe that, but I don't know. she's a complicated person. So, I mean, in the case of Boris Johnson, I'm pretty sure that it's cynicism and kind of enthusiasm for his career and desire to be prime minister that propelled him onwards. Did he really believe in Brexit? No, I didn't think so. Did he think that helping Brexit happen would make him popular inside the Tory party? Yes. And he was right. I mean, it did.
Yeah, and he's prime minister.
And now he's prime minister. That's what he wanted. So it's there are many mixed motives in a lot of these cases.
So you're referring in your book to a classic text, the French writer Julien Benda in his essay Trahison des clerics, the treason of the intellectuals from 1927. So what can we learn from this book from Julien Benda and his treason of the intellectuals?
So Julien Benda was describing a phenomenon that is not new to us, today. I mean, he was describing the phenomenon of intellectuals, philosophers, novelists who became attracted to radical political causes, and who, in his view, left the realm of art and philosophy and theory and moved into hard politics. And he describes some of them, and he writes about them as a phenomenon of both the left and the right in the era that he lived in. And he he simply described this phenomenon. And I sort of picked up that idea because it seemed, reflexive of or related to a similar phenomenon that we see today. So why are intellectuals attracted to these radical political movements? What does it give them? What power does it give them? What influence does it give them? And I felt that he was describing a phenomenon that I was also observing. And so, because again, one of the themes of the book is the circularity of history and how certain kinds of behavior and ideas come back. I thought that, it would be useful to the modern reader to explain where this came from.
Yeah, I think that's extremely interesting. How come that intellectuals are so attracted by authoritarianism throughout history? I mean, you have a lot of so-called fellow travelers during the 30s. You had people attracted to right-wing extremism also in the 30s and also today in the 60s and so on. And why are intellectuals so prone to so attracted by totalitarianism?
I mean, I'm not sure why anyone is surprised. I mean, intellectuals are, first of all, are attracted to new ideas. And so, in some cases, certainly communism was a new idea in the 30s that appealed to a lot of people. They're attracted to political movements that give them a role, where they can play a part and they can have a role in creating and then promoting and then selling these new ideas. Whether it's, communism in the past or the radical right in the present. I mean, it gives them it's better than sitting, for some people anyway, it's better than sitting in an office or in a university. That's part of it. I also think that, ideas of, that offer a total solution or a set of answers or a kind of simple explanation for the world appeal to not just intellectuals, but to everybody. The idea that you could just, solve, fix what's wrong in your society with a 3-word slogan, take back control. That was the brilliant Brexit solution. Of course, we all want to take back control and we want to, and offering people that, and then here, the appeal of that simple idea, the appeal of the single leader, we could get rid of all this nonsense and argument and need for consensus, and it's all very time consuming and really boring, and we could just have someone decide, and we could move the country forward in a decisive and rapid manner. I mean, I can understand why that appeals, as I said, not just intellectuals, but to lots of people. And I don't, but for intellectuals in particular, as I say, there's this possibility that they could play a role in creating and selling that idea. And that's appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah. I know that you among your many friends are Carl and Corazza Bildt in Sweden. And Carl Bildt is not only the former prime minister, foreign minister in Sweden, but also the former leader of the Moderate Party, which is the big major center-right party in Sweden. And in Carl Bildt's time, it was very much your run-of-the-mill European Liberal Party, and still is, I think. But at the same time, they are contemplating conquering power with the support of the Swedish manifestation of this right-wing populism, the Sweden Democrats. And would you advise them to enter that path, or do you see any dangers in a strategy like this, gaining government power with the support of the populist movement, if you are a run-of-the-mill center-right party?
So I am really hesitant to give anybody advice about Swedish politics, because although I know the general outlines and I know the parties that you're talking about, I don't know the exact how these ideas manifest themselves in Sweden in an intimate way, and I wouldn't want to make a mistake. I mean, actually, they're different. Different center-right parties have had different experiences. I mean, certainly, whatever decision the center-right parties take is hugely important, because it's usually the weakness or the fracturing of the center-right that leaves open the door for the far right or for the radical right. And there have been different tactics. I mean, in the United States, the mainstream of the Republican Party just gave up, and the party was taken over by the radical right, and may well be destroyed by it. I mean, we'll see over the next few months and years. Certainly many of the things that we all thought it stood for even 4 or 5 years ago seem to be completely gone. As I said, including faith in the American political system. You also have a case, I mean, look at Austria, where you have a center-right party, the Christian Democratic Party, that did join a coalition or did have the far-right Freedom Party in its coalition. And actually, through, partly because the Freedom Party stabbed itself in the back and it had a corrupt leader and who was taped and so on, but the center-right party eventually managed to push them out of politics. And so they did do a coalition with them for a while, and then they managed to take their votes away. I mean, something like that seems to have happened in Germany as well, whereby the Christian Democrats fought the AfD and sort of took their votes back. I'm sure AfD voters came partly from the center right and partly from maybe even from the extreme left, but so one way or another, the center right needs to find a way to win back those voters or to win the argument with those parties. And so I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast rule about it. As I said, Sebastian Kurz in Austria successfully defeated the far right by being in a coalition with them, and the CDU in Germany successfully defeated the far right, at least so far, by not being in a coalition with them and by excluding them. So, I mean, it really depends on the nature of politics. And in Sweden, I can't give you a formula. I mean, although I will repeat myself in that the decision made, but whatever the moderate party decides, is crucial, because it's, they need to reestablish themselves as the most important party for traditional minded or instinctivly conservative Swedish voters. And so they need to win the argument against the Sweden Democrats. And whether they do that best by creating a coalition with them or by fighting them, I don't know.
Our time is soon running up, but I would like to return to Poland and pose one more personal question to you. Because Poland is your second home country. You have a Polish citizenship. Your husband has been foreign minister in Poland, and you have a house there. And a couple of years ago, you published a Polish cookbook. I did, yeah, in a Polish country house kitchen. And later another book, and a book with interview with you called the Matka Polka, is that correct? Polish Mother. So I must ask you, how does it feel on a personal level to experience what the ruling party, Peace and Justice, are doing to the country and what it's doing to its international reputation? As being a person that's actually obviously loves Poland and loves to live in Poland.
I mean, I just find it very sad, you know, and in particular, this destruction of the country's international reputation, because so much goodwill and so much effort was put into building it. Obviously by my husband, who was foreign minister, but also by other people, by Carl Bildt, you know, by Swedish diplomats and statesmen. You know, there were these several big joint Polish projects, joint Swedish-Polish projects, you know, over the last decade or so. There was so much goodwill that came from Germany to Poland that was so important. You know, there were, you know, efforts made all across Europe to make a place for Poland, you know, Poland being the biggest of the Central European countries. And, you know, the decision to make Donald Tusk the president of the European Council. I mean, all those decisions were designed to make Poland feel at home and integrated in Europe. And they emerged from the goodwill of a lot of people, as well as I say, the enormous amount of effort on the part of so many people in Poland, you know, not just in the foreign ministry, but across all kinds of spheres of life. And to watch the ruling party kind of, you know, chuck that away and just, you know, throw away those, you know, 3 decades worth of carefully cultivated goodwill is very sad. And the worst part of it is that I don't think they even understand what it is that they're doing. I don't think they understand Europe. I don't think they understand what it means to have a reputation or why it matters. I don't think they understand the huge price that the country is going to pay now for the next decade. You know, I mean, it's really tragic to have, you know, such small-minded, such self-centered, and such cynical politicians in charge is depressing in any country. But mind you, you know, I feel that way about the United States. I mean, how the Republicans allowed themselves to be overrun by Trump and this kind of, you know, authoritarian Trumpism, and, you know, what they've sacrificed for that also makes no sense to me. So I don't know. I mean, politicians all over the world are capable of being narrow-minded and unthinking, and, you know, in their views. And I guess I don't know, it seems to be a disease of the age.
The last, I mean, this, as you said, your book ends with another New Year's Eve party, but I guess this will be more problematic to have a New Year's Eve party this year.
It's a summer party.
It's a summer party, okay. But have you any? That's the last question. Have you any New Year's Eve wishes for 2021? What do you hope of 2021? Are you pessimistic or are you hopeful?
Well, first of all, I hope in 2021 we get rid of the coronavirus. I mean, quite apart from all other politics, it's been such a difficult year for so many people. And, you know, I have, you know, teenage children, and I see how so many of their friends have suffered. And I really hope that we find our way out of this. And also, I do have some optimism about the Biden administration. If nothing else, they're going to set a different tone in international politics. They're going to be a different set of ambitions. The Western countries, and not just the West in the European sense, but all the world's democracies will at least, you know, for some period of time have a leader who's interested in them and who's interested in the concept of democracy and of international democracy and human rights. And that's going to be such a positive change for so many people. These things don't matter. They don't seem to matter until they do. And retrospectively, I think we'll see that this was an important moment of change. And I do hope that the Biden election heralds more elections in other countries. You know, I hope that, you know, more people come to realize that they've been lied to by authoritarian populists who don't necessarily have their interests at heart. And I hope that the democratic world collectively learns to fix some of its problems. We need to finally tackle the problem of the internet platforms, which are distorting our economies and our democracies. We need to tackle the problem of kleptocracy, the loose money that distorts all of our politics as well. And then we need, of course, to conquer the coronavirus and begin looking more seriously at climate change. And all those things I think are now possible. they've been made possible by the Biden victory, even if none of them are guaranteed.
Thank you very much, Anna Applebaum, for giving us this time. And the book is called, in Swedish, called Demokratins skymning. Looks like this. And you have all been watching Judisk kultur I Sverige live, Jewish culture in Sweden live, and you can also see it on the net, judiskultur.se, judiskultur.se. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And happy holidays.
Thank you.